Madam President, next month, students all over the United States will begin graduating from college. There's a lot of pride in that experience. Family and friends will gather and celebrate. These young graduates are going to be filled with hope, expectation, and gratitude to those who helped them reach this milestone in their lives. But they're also going to be graduating with debt. In some cases, massive amounts of debt. 96% of for-profit college students will graduate with a debt of $33,000. 15% of them, 1 out of 6, will default on their loans within 2 years. There's now more than $1 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. As I mentioned on the floor several times, a little over a year ago, for the first time in history, student loan debt in America surpassed credit card debt. One of the reasons there's been such a huge influx is that college costs continue to rise at unsustainable rates. Tuition and fees at four-year schools have rocketed up 300% from 1990 through 2011. And over the same period, broad inflation was just 75%. Even healthcare costs rose at half the rate of the cost of higher education. The average for-profit college costs $30,900 a year in tuition and fees. Private, nonprofit institutions aren't too far behind. Average tuition and fees run about $26,600. Schools with larger endowments charge even more, upwards of $50,000 to $57,000 in total fees. They use their endowment to give students large financial aid packages, which is admirable, but it has consequences. The elevated sticker price for these schools provides for-profit colleges the cover to raise their prices to similar levels. And let me remind you, for-profit schools, for-profit colleges in America get more, up to and more than 90% of their revenue directly from the federal government. They are 10% away from being federal agencies. Students graduating this year have one advantage. If they took out federal subsidized loans, their interest rate is low. In 2007, Congress set interest rates on subsidized federal student loans for the last several years. Current graduates have low, affordable interest rates on their federal loans from 6.8% to 3.4%, depending on the year they took out the loan. Graduates next year may not be so lucky. The interest rate goes up to 6.8% for all unless Congress acts. That's because these rates, set to double for 740 million students across the country on 1st of July, will only be changed if Congress acts. That's going to affect 365,000 plus borrowers in my state of Illinois. Each borrower in Illinois will save $1,000 plus over the lifetime of their loan if current interest rates of 3.4% continue. Across the state, borrowers will save a total of $387,000. Every week in my office, we hear from students who would be directly affected by interest rate increases. One of them is George Jacobs, a constituent of mine and graduate of the International Academy of Design and Technology in Chicago, a for-profit college owned by the Career Education Corporation. Every day of his life, George Jacobs regrets that he ever attended this school. He's 29 years old. His current private student loan balance has ballooned to $107,000. The original loan was $60,000. But with a variable interest rate, George has been paying anywhere from 7 to 13.9%. Now you combine that with his federal loan balance, and his total outstanding student loan debt is $142,000. George isn't even 30 years old. He already has the debt the size of some people's mortgages on their homes. Unlike a lot of his peers who attend for-profit colleges, George has a job in his field of study. But his annual salary of $45,000, but since his lender won't let him consolidate the loan, his monthly payment on that annual salary is $1,364 a month. Half of his income goes to pay his loan. Unfortunately, because of high interest rates, very little of this payment reduces the principal. He doesn't know when he'll possibly pay off this loan. When asked if he's tried to work out a plan with his lender, he says they won't talk to him. They just don't care. George was the first in his immediate family to attend college. He didn't ask people for advice on financial matters. He trusted the school. George was subjected to high-pressure sales that some for-profit colleges use. Reflecting on that experience now, George feels like the school took advantage of him. He feels the school's primary focus is to identify people they can make money off of. George owes about $29,000 in federal loans. With low interest rates, his monthly payment is $230 a month on the federal loans. Amount, he said, is not a real problem. He's married, and although he and his wife own a car, he doesn't think they'll ever qualify for a mortgage. Madam President, he's 29 years old. George is not the only one affected by the private student loans. His parents are in their 50s. To help George, they co-signed his private student loan. They cannot refinance the mortgage on their home because of George's outstanding debt. There was a story in the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago of a woman, a grandmother, who now has her Social Security check garnished because she was kind enough to co-sign her granddaughter's college loan. Her granddaughter has defaulted. Her grandmother is watching her Social Security check reduced. Making college affordable shouldn't be partisan. It affects everybody. Just this week, during a news conference in Pennsylvania, Governor Mitt Romney acknowledged the tough job market new graduates face and expressed support for keeping interest rates low. He said, "I fully support the effort to extend low interest rates on student loans. Temporary relief on interest rates for students is a result of, in part, because of the extremely poor conditions in the job market." Higher education isn't a luxury anymore. It's part of the American dream that many of us bought into and invested in. An educated workforce will make us a stronger nation. By 2018, 63% of jobs will require post-secondary education. Keeping debt levels low and manageable for college graduates is essential. George Jacobs, like so many other students I've spoken about on this floor, are going to spend the rest of their young adult life paying for student loans. There's always been a lot of talk around here about mortgage crises, and rightly so. But think about 17 and 18 and 19-year-old students signing away their income for the next 30 years before they can even dream of a job or owning a home. We're going to consider legislation when we get back from the break in about 10 days on making sure that student loan interest rates are manageable. There's more to this issue. We have to deal with the reality that the President raised in the State of the Union address. This spiraling cost of higher education is unsustainable and unfair, fundamentally unfair. And you say to the young people, get educated for your future. And they follow our advice and walk into the student loan trap. Unfortunately, many for-profit schools are the worst offenders. These schools have an enrollment that's grown 225% over the past 10 years. According to the Chronicle of Higher Education, enrollment at for-profit colleges in my state has grown 556% over the last 10 years. They enrolled 1.2 million students in 2009. In the 2008-2009 academic year, the GAO found that for-profit colleges took in $24 billion in Title IV aid. Four-year for-profit schools cost an average of $27,900 a year before aid, as compared to $16,900 for public four-year universities. The chief executives at most of the for-profit schools, parents' company, make many times more than their counterparts in nonprofit schools. Remember, 90% plus of their revenue comes directly from the federal government. These aren't great entrepreneurs. These are folks who have managed to tap into one of the most generous federal subsidies in the law. And 5 years ago, we gave them a break. In the bankruptcy bill, we said private for-profit schools will be the only private loans in America that are not dischargeable in bankruptcy, which means you carry them to the grave. So the for-profit schools give these private loans, the students and their parents sign up for them, and when it's all said and done, they end up saddled with this impossible debt for a lifetime. That's not even to go to the question about whether or not they're receiving any kind of valuable education in the process. For-profits, incidentally, spent 21% plus of their expenses on instruction, 21% on instruction. It was 29.5% at public institutions, 32.7% at private nonprofit institutions. USA Today reported that for-profits educate fewer than 10% of students, take in 25% of all federal aid to education, and account for 44% of defaults among borrowers. Remember those numbers, 10, 25, and 44. They're taking in 10% of the students, taking in 25% of all the federal aid to education, and 44% of the defaults on student loans are attributable to these for-profit schools. According to the Project on Student Debt, 96% of for-profit college students graduate with some debt, compared to 72% of private nonprofit grads, 62% of public school grads. The Project on Student Debt also reported that borrowers who graduated from for-profit four-year programs have an average debt of $33,000 compared to $27,006 at private nonprofits, $20,000 at public schools. Last year, the Department of Education released a report showing that for-profit schools have a student loan default rate overall of 15%, compared with 7.2% at public schools, 4.6% at private nonprofit schools. Madam President, if I were to stand before you and talk about any other business in America, heavily subsidized by the federal government, beyond 90% of all the revenues they take in, that is luring students and their families into unmanageable debt, I would hope that both sides of the aisle would stand up and say that is unacceptable. How can we subsidize an operation that is causing such hardship on students and their families, hardship that they're going to carry for a lifetime? George Jacobs, at age 29, writing off the possibility of ever owning a home because he signed up at one of these for-profit schools in my state. Madam President, the U.S. Senate Help Committee also discovered that out of $640 million in post-9/11 GI benefits, a bill we were all proud to vote for, out of the $640 million that flowed to for-profit schools in the last academic year, $439 million went to the largest 15 publicly traded companies. For-profit colleges are receiving $1 out of every $2 in military tuition assistance, according to the Department of Defense. And more than 60% of education benefits available to military spouses go to for-profit schools. This is significant. We capped federal aid to for-profit schools at 90% of their revenue, but we created an exception for the GI Bill. So some of them are up to 95% federal subsidy, and still we have these terrible results and terrible indebtedness. Students at for-profit colleges have lower success rates than similar students in public and nonprofit colleges, including graduation rates, employment outcomes, debt levels, and loan default rates. Yet, the Department of Defense is paying more to for-profit schools for the GI Bill than public and nonprofit institutions. Madam President, I want to enter into the record here, along with my remarks, an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, April 18th. It tells the story of Jody Ramin, who between the ages of 18 and 22 took out $74,000 in student loans. She attended Kent State University, a public university in Ohio. It seemed like a good investment at the time, but now it's going to delay her career, her marriage, and her decision to have children. Ms. Ramin's $900 a month loan payments eat up 60% of the paycheck she earns as bank teller in South Carolina, the best job she could get after graduating from college. Her fiance spends 40% of his paycheck on student loans. They each work more than 60 hours a week and volunteer where they can to help with local high school and basketball teams, football and basketball teams. Ms. Ramin works a second job as a waitress, making all her loan payments on time. She can't buy a house. They can't visit their families in Ohio as often as they would like, or spend money to even go out. Plans to marry or have children are on hold, says Ms. Ramin. I'm just looking for some way to manage my finances. This is an indication of a debt crisis that is coming. It's different, I would agree, than the mortgage debt crisis that we faced. Smaller in magnitude, perhaps, but no less insidious and no less of a problem for us when it comes to the growth of our economy. Madam President, I have a couple bills pending. One of them goes to a very basic question. Should any college, public, private, profit, nonprofit, be allowed to lure a student into a private student loan when they are still eligible for government loans? In other words, shouldn't that be one of the causes for a discharge in bankruptcy? It's fraud. It's fraud to say to that student, you have to take out this private student loan, even though the school knows that student is still eligible for low interest rates accommodating federal loans. They're luring them into a debt that is unnecessary and a debt which is crushing in some circumstances. Now, at the very minimum, that should be considered fraud in a bankruptcy court. And that debt should be dischargeable in bankruptcy because of the failure of the school to disclose that the student still has eligibility for a federal loan. Secondly, I know that I'm probably crying in the wilderness here, but I still find it inconceivable that the only private sector business loan in America that is not dischargeable in bankruptcy goes to these heavily subsidized for-profit schools. First, we lord them with federal money, 90% plus, and then we turn around and say, and we'll protect you when the student who is likely to default ends up defaulting. We'll make sure that they still have the debt, carrying it to the grave. What were we thinking? To give this one business this kind of fantastic federal subsidy and this kind of amazing support in the bankruptcy code. I will tell you, I ask consent to enter into the record, along with that article from the Wall Street Journal, a recent article from Barron's, thank you, Madam President, of April the 16th. So they identified those who are offering these private student loans. The major players in the private non-government-backed student loan market, SLM, let me translate, formerly known as Sallie Mae, Discover Financial Services, Wells Fargo, and PNC Financial Services. Even with the defaults, if there are defaults on these loans are protected because they continue forever. Madam President, I don't know if my colleagues will join me in this, but all I ask them to do is go home and please talk to some of the families in your state. And you will find out that this student loan crisis is not just something manufactured by politicians. It is real, and we are complicit in it. When we allow low-performing and worthless schools to receive federal aid to education, students and their families are lured into believing these are real schools. Go to the internet and put in the word college or university, click the mouse and watch what happens. You will be inundated with ads from for-profit schools. Some of them will tell you can go to school online. One of them ran a television ad here in Washington, I think they've taken it off the air now, that showed this lovely young girl who was in her bedroom, in her pajamas, with her computer or laptop on the bed. And the purpose of the ad was, you can graduate from college at home in your pajamas. It's a ruse, it's a farce, it's a fraud. Many times these schools offer nothing but debt for these students. And the students who drop out, the worst of circumstances. They don't even get the worthless diploma from the for-profit school. All they get is the debt. That's not fair. If we have a responsibility, and I think we do, to families across America, for goodness sakes, on a bipartisan basis, we should step up and deal with the student debt crisis and the for-profit schools who are exploiting it. Madam President, I yield the floor.